of clock jokes this morning. I didn't want to waste any time walking up. So anyway, we got home and my dad said he said, when you get up there, tell him that you need to make sure the clock works for one rotation, that it works for a whole hour. So you're going to, observe that tonight. I said, well, how about I just tell him it's too far back, I can't see it. And what I decided to tell you is that no one my age knows how to read that kind of clock. So, it's all for naught. Anyway, this evening, we are continuing our Countercultural series that has been spanning the last couple of months. We're looking at how a Christian ought to live different from the world. A Christian should be countercultural. And this concept comes from the verse in Romans chapter 12 and verse 2, which says, "Do not be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind." Christians should be different. At its basic level, Christians look different from the world. And we've looked at that, how that's going to affect the Christian's life in a couple of different ways. First of all, how it affects our speech. There are things Christians should and should not say. And God's given us a very powerful tool to enter into this world with our words. We looked at how a Christian's consumption is countercultural, what we do and don't put into our bodies and what we do and don't put into our minds. And then the last one was we looked at how a Christian's appearance should be countercultural. We should, like I said, look different. Whether that's people's perception of us or our physical appearance, a Christian looks different from the world. So tonight, we're looking at our relationships. As Christians, we need to be countercultural in our relationships. That's with our brothers and sisters in Christ. That's with our family members. That's with people who are not members of the church. That's with our co-workers. Every relationship that a Christian has should look different. And this may not be one that you immediately come to and go, oh, I have an idea of how we can be different. And so I want to start off by asking, how does our culture view relationships? What does our culture think about relationships? I think the biggest thing that defines relationships in our culture is, what can they do for me? When you think about a relationship, you think, what am I going to get out of this relationship? And we don't usually say it with such a selfish slant, but maybe it goes something like this. Ooh, I can't wait until I have a boyfriend. He's going to bring me coffee at work. Right? I can't wait until I'm older and I get to talk to my parents and tell them how I really feel. Oh, I can't wait until I'm, married and my wife will take care of this laundry that I don't ever do anyway. I mean, when we think about relationships, a lot of times our mindset is, what am I going to get out of it? A business partnership. I can't wait to do business with this person. It's going to make me a lot of money, right? Like, this is a lot of the time, this is the way our world will approach relationships. And it's just selfish. I don't mean to be such a downer, but this is just kind of the way our world looks at life, is what am I going to get out of that relationship? And so how should a Christian view relationships? Well, the challenge, I think, is not seeing what I can get, but seeing what I can give. And so as Christians, if we're going to be countercultural, if we're going to look different from the world, our relationships are not centered around what we get out of them, rather what we can give to the other people in them. And so we're going to look at a couple of things that have to do with that tonight. We're going to talk first about how we do this, and then we're going to finish with a little bit of why this is so important. So the first thing we really need to do, if we're going to be countercultural in our relationships, if we're going to be givers and not takers, is we need to think differently about other people. Our world often doesn't think about other people. Christians need to start there. We need to think about other people, but more importantly, we need to think a little bit differently about other people. Firstly, we need to understand, and we've talked about this a number of times, from, I don't want to say selfish because it's not selfish, but from a personal standpoint, we've talked about this a number of times. Every person here has an inherent value to God, right? If that's true about me, that's true about you. And if that's true about you, it should shape how I treat you, right? Every person has an inherent value. In Genesis chapter 1, God says that he made us in his image. What exactly that means, there's a lot of debate, and there are a lot of right answers, I think. But what it definitely means is that every person you come into contact with is God's image and deserves to be treated as such. So God saw fit to give this person in your life, this relationship that you have with this person, God saw fit to give them life. So the least we can do is give them some of our time, some of our thought, some of our effort in this relationship to give and not to take. Secondly, look at Philippians chapter 2. If we're going to think differently about others, we have to understand that they have the same inherent value to God that we do. And when we understand that, Paul writes in Philippians a great verse about how we ought to really think about other people. Philippians chapter 2 and verse 3, Paul writes, "Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others as more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to your own interests, but also to the interests of others. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus." Listen, Paul is exhorting the church in Philippi, and I believe every Christian after, not to think about themselves first, but to think about others first. I mean, this is a simple concept, and yet so often in our world, simply thinking about others as more important than yourselves is countercultural. If we're going to be countercultural in our relationships, we have to esteem others as more significant than ourselves. And you notice in verse 4, Paul doesn't say it's wrong to look out for your own interests, right? He says, let each of you look out not only for your own interests, but also for the interests of others. This is not about entire self-denial of any basic needs. This is about considering other people as more important than yourself. Looking to how will what I'm doing affect someone else? Simply thinking about giving to a relationship and not only taking. And the last thing, when it comes to thinking about other people differently and having countercultural relationships, we have to believe all things. Look at 1 Corinthians chapter 13. I'll tell you, this is a verse that gave me fits growing up. I couldn't reconcile believing all things. I didn't know what it meant, and I thought when you read it at face value, it feels like it means love is an idiot because they just believe everything everyone tells them. That just doesn't seem right, and I don't believe that's what Paul is really getting at here. I think it really connects to what Dad was saying this morning. When you look at verse 7 of 1 Corinthians 13, Paul writes that love bears all things, it believes all things, it hopes all things, and it endures all things. This morning we talked about judgment, judging others, which is kind of a hot topic nowadays. And one of the things that was mentioned is what we are not judges of. And certainly someone's salvation, we are not the judge. But the other point I thought really applies here is we are not the judges of others' motives. We are not the judges of other people's hearts. And so what is this verse really saying? I believe it's really hitting on that same point. Love believes the best in all things. Love doesn't believe someone is out to hurt you, right? Love doesn't believe someone did that because they wanted something over you. Love believes that the motivation is the best. Love believes the best about all things. Now, how does that help us in having countercultural relationships? Well, I want to give you a personal example. From time to time, I help Ryan Wilkins with his moving business. And sometimes in the moving business, you'll get a call. And they'll say, hey, I just need a real short move. It's, one couch, one bed, and 2 pieces of furniture. And you show up, and there's 1 couch, 1 bed, and 2 pieces of furniture. And you're in and out, and it's great. But other times, and Chris is nodding because he knows, other times you get a call and they say it's 1 couch, 1 bed, and 2 pieces of furniture, and you show up and you are on your 3rd trip with the 5th couch, and you've now carried 7 dressers down the stairs. Sometimes what people do, and this is sad, but honestly, sometimes what people do is they will tell you what you want to hear on the phone because they want to get you to come out to their house and move them at a certain date. And so they'll tell you, hey, we don't have much, just get out here and see it for yourself. And then you get there and they have much. They have too much. And, it's just, the sad fact is some people do that selfishly. It's happened to me a time or two. And what I have realized is that when I think they are taking advantage of me, it makes that move incredibly difficult. It makes wrapping their furniture just the worst thing, right? And so what I've started doing, what I try and do, is assume that they are bad at counting. I've tried to assume that maybe they forgot about a room. I don't give them every out possible. That's my plan. And I know it sounds silly, but sincerely, it makes the day of work easier. Just to believe the best about someone, to love someone by believing all things, changes the way you think about them, changes the way you interact with them, helps you put a smile on your face, and helps you have a countercultural relationship, even though maybe they lied. This is what being countercultural in our relationships is. It's about thinking differently about other people and loving other people. But the bottom line is, not only do we need to think differently about other people, we need to have that influence our actions, right? As James says in James Chapter 2, faith without works is dead, so as anything else without works is usually dead, okay? This principle of James is wisdom for nearly every facet of life. He says in I got to flip over there quickly, but he says in chapter 2, in verse 16, on the subject of faith without works is dead, he says, if one of you says, verse 15, if a brother or sister is poorly clothed and lacking in daily food, and one of you says to them, go in peace, be warmed and filled, without giving them the things they need for the body, what good is that? You almost hear James writing this like, this is madness. No one would do that if they really cared about someone. If we're going to be countercultural in our relationships, it's not just about thinking differently about other people, recognizing their inherent value to God, recognizing or considering them above yourselves and believing the best about them. It's also about acting on what you're thinking about someone. We have to put our faith into works. And if we simply say good things to people but don't work for them, we're not truly changing anything about our relationship. Matthew chapter 25, of course, is another great example where Jesus is telling a parable about the end of the age, and he says that inasmuch as you did it to one of the least of these, you did it for me. You know what the qualifier is there? Did it. If you didn't do it, he had a whole other list for those who didn't do it in Matthew chapter 25. It's important that not only do we think positively about others, but we actually serve other people. Look at Matthew chapter 7. Matthew chapter 7 and verse 12. Some call this the golden rule. I didn't realize it, but the ESV calls it the golden rule. Jesus says, so whatever you wish that others would do to you, do also to them, for this is the law and the prophets. Whatever you wish that others would do to you, do to them. It's not simply about what you wish others would think about you. It's not simply about how you wish others would feel about you. It's what you want them to do to you. You do to them. This implies action. And if we're going to be countercultural in our relationships, we need to act, not just think. The last verse on this that I want to look at is in Matthew chapter 20. Matthew chapter 20, and if you saw our bulletin, this is the scripture reading for this evening. But Matthew chapter 20 and verse 28, Jesus says, even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and give his life as a ransom for many. See, Jesus says, plain as day, I didn't come so that you could serve me. I came so that I could serve you. That, in a nutshell, if I read that one verse and said the one thing we said at the beginning about being countercultural in our relationships, I think that's enough, isn't it? Jesus said, it's not about what I get from you. It's about what I can give to you. And if we're going to be Christians who are countercultural in our relationships, we have to go into these relationships thinking, what can I give? Not what can I get? The last thing I want to talk about, and we kind of mentioned it at the beginning, is why does this matter? Well, why is this so important that we are countercultural in our relationships? The bottom line, you guys think I'm done early. I'm not. The bottom line, I saw a couple faces. Last thing. Oh, okay. Maybe I can read that clock. Anyway, the last thing. The bottom line is being countercultural in our relationships means serving other people. It's not just about thinking differently of them, but it's about serving other people. And if we're going to be countercultural in our relationships, we will be servants. Serving other people is loving your neighbor as yourself. All right? So being countercultural in our relationships really simply is loving your neighbor as yourself. So many times we are looking for a friend that will meet our need. And I really don't think that's sinful. Please understand what I'm saying. It's just really our mindset. I know that Courtney and I, from time to time, have looked for friends who were in the same stage of life as us, right? Some friends who were young married, or some friends who had young children. And we want a friend to meet our need, right? That we can have some commonality with. Or I'm definitely guilty of wanting a friend who likes to work out, because I like to work out. Jesus, he didn't look for a friend to meet his need. He looked for a need so that he could be that person's friend. This is what countercultural in relationships looks like. And this is important because it's what Jesus did. John chapter 15, if you turn over there, a verse I'm certain that we're familiar with. John chapter 15, and verse 12, John writes the account of Jesus speaking, "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you. Greater love has no one than this, that someone lay down his life for his friends. You are my friends if you do what I commanded you." John 15, 12 through 14. Now, I want to point just a couple of things out here. Make sure I'm not stepping on the rest of my notes. I want to point just a couple of things out here about this verse. The first thing he says is, "This is my commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you," right? When was Jesus saying this? Before or after the cross? It was before. John chapter 15 comes before John chapter 20 when Jesus dies on the cross. Immediately following this, he says, "Greater love is no one than this, that someone laid down his life for his friends." Now, I've read that verse my entire life and just thought, well, of course, everyone in here would agree the most noble act would be diving and taking a bullet for someone else, right? Like that's the greatest love you could show for someone. And I don't think that Jesus is excluding that from what he's saying here. But I think what he's saying is a lot harder than a momentary action. I think what Jesus is saying here is far more similar to what he says in Luke chapter 9 when he says, "Take up your cross daily and follow me." I think what Jesus is saying here is love one another as I have loved you, laying down your life every day for your friend. That doesn't mean dying every single day, but it means changing your decisions because you're considering other people as more important than yourselves. See, it's a lot harder to make that choice every single day to love somebody and to lay down your life for them every single day than it is to do it once. When you think about when you were dating, if you dated before you got married, when you were dating, it was nice and it was fun and it was great, and you went on dates and then you got to go home at the end, right? Different example. My dad said this today, so I'm going to use this example. He was telling Julio came over for dinner this afternoon, and Stephanie came over, and he was telling them that the great thing about grandkids is they can go home, right? They get fussy. It gets to be nap time, and you've had all the fun, and you drop nap time on the parents, and they get to go. Why is that easier? Because it's a lot harder to day in and day out deal with the tantrums and deal with the fussiness and teething, which is, who knew that was so hard, right? I mean, it's so much easier to deal with things in moments than it is to deal with them daily. And I believe what Jesus is saying here is that greater love has no one than this, that he would lay down his life every day for his friend. Like I said, I don't think Jesus is discounting laying down your life in one moment of taking the bullet. But I believe what he is really teaching here is to love one another as up to this point he has loved his disciples, which was every day, walking with them, teaching them, performing miracles, letting them follow him, taking children on his knee, not having a place to lay his head. That's how Jesus loved his disciples up until then. And I believe that's what he's saying in this verse, that greater love has no one than this, that he would lay down his life for his friends, both every single day and in the ultimate sacrifice. John 13 and verse 35 is another verse I'm sure that many of us can quote. Jesus says, a new command, very similar passage. Verse 34, he says, "A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another. Just as I have loved you, you also are to love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." This is what being countercultural in relationships is, church. It's loving one another, loving your neighbor as yourself. That is a different relationship than you see in the world. I want to use one example. And I don't normally do this, so forgive me for the long story, but I believe it makes the point in a way that some other stories wouldn't be able to. I was at a, I guess it was a conference. Is it a conference? A lectureship? Over at the Faith Village Church of Christ in Wichita Falls, Texas. And at this lectureship, a brother named Chris Swinford got up and presented a lesson. And I don't know if you've ever heard Chris speak, but he is one of the most masterful storytellers I've ever heard. And also, it doesn't hurt that he has incredible stories to tell through years of mission work and working with some other churches. Chris was telling this story, and I want to retell this story. And he told me one time he heard somebody tell his stories from the first person, and it felt dirty. He didn't like it. It was weird that someone was telling his story as if it happened to them. So if Chris watches this, Chris, this is your story. I'm going to use it, okay? Chris was telling the whole class about a time when he got to take the gospel to the Ukraine. It was back when the Ukraine, I guess, first was accepting people to come in. I don't remember the political state of the Ukraine in the 80s. I wasn't alive. But Chris got to go. And so when the Ukraine opened up, some of the Bible schools or Bible colleges got in touch with some of their teachers and members and faculty and said, "Hey, we're sending some people over to take the gospel to the Ukraine." And Chris and his family, his wife and his two sons, signed up to go. They got on a plane, they flew over to the Ukraine, and as they got off the plane, they met this young man. I say young, he was probably in his mid-20s, named Maxime. All right, and Maxime was an ox of a man. He said he was just a beast. All right, he picked up my bag, picked up my wife's bag, threw both of my son's bags over his shoulders, and then grabbed one more bag on a cart, and he was dragging all of our luggage, wouldn't let us carry a thing, up to our room. Now, Maxime, one thing that's important to note is that Maxime had some mental handicaps. He was roughly the age of a 10 or 11-year-old, and that was where his development had stopped. But it didn't change his physical development, because he was a big guy, and he was very strong. And Chris he remarked at how he could take all of this luggage on his own and carry it up 7 floors to their hotel. And they had to carry it up 7 floors because, as Chris will tell you, the elevators in Ukraine are never fixed. And I actually met someone from the Ukraine. I told them that part of the story, and they said, "Oh yeah, never fixed." So at this particular hotel, Maxime carries all of their luggage up 7 flights of stairs up to the 7th floor. And he told Chris, in a very concerned and happy way, the 7th floor is the safest floor. This is a 10-floor building. And he said, robbers, they hit the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, 10, 9, and 8th floors all the time. But they get sick of the stairs by about then, and so you're really safe on the 7th floor. Which is a little concerning when you've just moved your whole family to the Ukraine. So Maxime is showing him the ropes, telling him all about the church in the Ukraine and customs in the Ukraine, and he's just so incredibly helpful. And he's doing everything he can for Chris and his family. And And of course, with Maxime's mental age, he got along great with Chris's 7 and 8-year-old son. And so Maxime, that night, he gets them up to their room, and they have some conversations, and he tells them, hey, you guys, we're going to go to church in the morning. I'll be here at 6 a.m., and you be ready to leave at 6 a.m. And Chris said, 6 a.m.? He said, oh, yeah. All the churches in the area stagger their services, so if you want to go to all of them, you can. I assume you'd want to go to all of them, and so I'll be here at 6 a.m. So what he didn't realize is that after Maxime left, he went to every meeting place of the churches with the songbooks. And what Maxime would do, and this is precious, is he would set the songbooks out on the chairs. Not, like we have songbooks on our chairs. But what he would do specifically is he would lay the songbooks just a little bit off the edge. And he said it was so that all the ladies who had their fingernails done wouldn't mess them up on the chairs. He was so concerned with taking care of other people that the detail of the songbook on the chair, he wanted to make sure that was done right. And so Maxime shows up 6 a.m. and they run the mill of all the congregations in the area. And it's a great day. And of course, throughout the months, Maxime grew really close to Chris and his family. He would come over all the time. Chris said that Maxime would play superhero with his sons because that was one thing that translated really well from America to the Ukraine is superheroes. And so he said one of my sons would be Captain America, of course, and one of my sons would be Spider-Man, and then Maxime, he was the Hulk. All right? And so the way that game usually ended was, hey, Spider-Man, do you want to fly? So that was a bond that they had between Maxime and the Swinford family. Chris, while he was there, started a small Bible school to help the people in that area grow their Bible knowledge. Anyone that wanted to come take classes, and they would just learn about the Bible, learn some things that you and I may take for granted, okay? And so Chris would, do it kind of like probably at a roughly high school level that he would teach them, and they'd have tests, and they'd do lectures, and they'd do projects, and it was all designed really just to help the knowledge in that area. And so after a couple of months, Maxime came to Chris and said, Mr. Chris, I really want to go to the classes, but I have not graduated the school in Ukraine yet. Is it okay if I come? And Chris, knowing the challenge that would be, said, of course, Maxime. Of course you can come. Of course you can learn. And throughout that time, Maxime, he struggled in the classes, just to be honest about it. His reading comprehension was very challenging. His reading was very challenging, and so he struggled through these classes. And Chris tried to be as gracious as he would like God to be, while also being as fair to a academic setting as he could. And so throughout the time, Maxime would kind of have his own section of work cut out for him. Chris would teach everyone else, and then he'd kind of work with Maxime on the side. But one day, Chris was doing a lesson on service, kind of like what we're talking about today, and he said, hey, this is service, this is what Christians need to do, and I'm sure he used the phrase countercultural in our relationships because that resonates in every culture, right? Anyway, so Chris is teaching this lesson, and he felt like, they're not getting it. Something about this classroom setting and this lecture is not getting the point of service across. So what Chris did is he decided we're going to have an object lesson. We all like object lessons, right? Because we're going to have an object lesson. We're going to go to a nursing home, and we're going to help them out. What you need to understand about Ukrainian nursing homes is there are really 3 levels of senior care in the Ukraine. Level 1, you've got a lot of family, and they take care of you because they have the money to take care of another person in their house. Best option. Level 2, you don't have a lot of family, but you got a lot of money, and you get some adequate care. It's not great, not really even what we would consider a bad nursing home in America, but you do get taken care of. Level 3 is you don't have any family, and you don't have any money, and you have to live somewhere. That is where they went. They went to a level 3 government-run nursing home. And Chris had called ahead, and he said, I've got some students, and we're going to come, and we're going to work with you guys for the day. Whatever tasks, he said, I've got 30 students, we're going to pair up, give me the 15 worst tasks that you guys have. the things no one wants to do. And so they went ahead and got the list drawn up. And on that day, he said, all right, class, we're going on a field trip. And they didn't have too far to go. It was just, less than a mile down the road to get to the nursing home. So they load up and they walk over there. They pair off in twos, and Chris and Maxime got to be in a pair. And so as they're loading up, Chris kind of explains, here's what we're doing here. Here's why we're doing it. Remember, service is an important part of the Christian life as you're doing these tasks that no one else wants to do. So the employee of the nursing home has their list, and they get up and they say, we'll begin with the worst task, cleaning the 6-month-old bedpans. Apparently they had a closet full. They didn't have the staff to clean them regularly, so they had a closet. And when they needed a new one, they'd clean it. And that was the worst task on the list. Chris said he said he was sitting there thinking, man, that's the worst. I don't want to get that one. And without missing a beat, Maxime raises his hand and said, Mr. Chris and I will do that. And Chris turns to him and says, well, Maxime, I was going to let somebody else take that one. And Maxime says, Mr. Chris, don't you think the most mature of us should take the worst task? What do you say to that, right? So they cleaned bedpans. Chris described it as Maxime working like a horse and him having to run out of the room every couple of seconds to not, add to the mess. So a few days later, after this experience of cleaning old bedpans, Maxime comes up to Chris and he says, Mr. Chris, I am not very good at school, which was true. It was very true. And he says, but I believe I have found a place where I can serve Jesus better, and it's at the nursing home. And so from that day forward, what Maxime decided to do was spend the bulk of his day going and just completely volunteering at this nursing home, cleaning sheets, cleaning bedpans, changing light bulbs, moving bedroom furniture, whatever they needed. That is what Maxime did. That is who he was for that day. And so this is a beautiful thing. Chris is excited for him. It's a great thing to find a purpose, isn't it? Isn't it a great thing to find, this is how I can serve God? And so Maxime has found that, and a couple of months go by, and Maxime's family had their challenges. His father, if I remember correctly, was an alcoholic, was completely uninvolved, and his mother was struggling in a number of other ways. But Chris gets a call from Maxime's mom a couple months later. And he's in class. He has to step out of class to answer the call. And she says, Mr. Chris, you have to come quick. Something's happened to Maxime, and they say he's not moving. I told you it wasn't very far. And so without missing a beat, this almost third son to Chris is in trouble. He says, we're pausing class, and he takes off, and he runs down the street to get to the nursing home. And unfortunately, what he found was that Maxime was on the floor and he was cold, and he had passed away. He ended up having to, because I guess this is how it happens in the Ukraine, he picked Maxime's body up and carried him back to his mother. He brought him back to his house, and his mom was weeping. Everyone was weeping. And they began to make funeral arrangements. They don't really know what happened to Maxime. They know that he was doing something with electricity and maybe something happened there. But all they really know is that he fell over and no one was there to really attend to him at the time, and he passed away. Chris, to this day, will tell you that he passed away because he loved people too much. But anyway, we'll ask him when we get there. So they're planning the funeral. And there are some strange customs. They're strange to us. They're not strange to everyone. But in the Ukraine, they plan a feast at the end of someone's life. And they have this big feast where they have the person who has passed on's favorite meal. They serve, for me, it would probably be chicken fried steak, right? They have the person's favorite meal, and what everyone does is they get a portion of that meal, and they go by the casket, and they scrape a portion of that off in to share one final meal with their loved one. And so, of course, it's not a great time, but it is a way of honoring a person that you loved. They share their meal, and Chris and his family go, and they share a portion of their last meal. What Chris's sons decided to do was, because they said Maxime wouldn't like any of this food, they brought a bunch of candy. And they dumped buckets of candy into the grave with Maxime, along with their Incredible Hulk toy, because he was the Hulk. And so it's a very emotional funeral. Chris preaches the funeral, and as they're at the graveside and they're finishing up the funeral, this bus pulls up. Out of absolutely nowhere, this bus pulls up, and Chris sees what he thinks are the toys from Toy Story in Sid's room. He said it was wheelchairs and crutches and limps, and he said it was just this kind of mess of unhealthy-looking people. And he said they gimped on up to me, and this first lady, who apparently was the one who spoke the best English, said, "Are you the priest of Maxime?" And he said, you know, I can be honest enough to fix this later and continue the conversation. Sure. Yeah, I'm the priest of Maxime. And she said, good, I want to go to the church of Maxime. He said, well, it's not his church, but we can fix that. Let's talk. And he said, one person after another came up to him asking the same two questions. Are you the priest of Maxime? I want to go to the church of Maxime. You see, what happened here is 30 people who lived in that nursing home were baptized into Christ and obeyed the gospel because Maxime chose to be countercultural in his relationships. Because Maxime chose to love his neighbor as himself. In his death, 30 people were baptized. But it really wasn't his death that made that impact. It was daily esteeming others as more important than himself. It was every day laying down his life for someone else. See, this is why this is so important. If Christians are going to be countercultural and Christians are going to fulfill the mission that we've been given by Christ to preach the gospel, to love our neighbor as ourselves, and to ultimately love God first, we have to be countercultural in our relationships. It doesn't say in 1 John 13 and 35 that they will know that we are followers of Jesus Christ by our doctrine. It doesn't say it. It doesn't say that they'll know we are followers of Christ by our knowledge or our insight or our charisma or our comedy. It doesn't say any of that. It says they will know that person follows Jesus because of our love for one another. If we are to be followers of Christ, we must be countercultural in our relationships, just like Christ was. He came not to be served, but to serve and to give his life both every day he was here and ultimately on the cross to pave a way for us back to a relationship with God. Amen. That's the invitation. That's why we do this thing at the end called the invitation, is because Christ opened the door for us to have a relationship with God. And so if you have need to accept that invitation and to obey the gospel, you can let that be made known this evening. Or if you have any other need to maybe today the coming forward isn't necessary. You just need to change the way you've been acting in your relationships. Do it today, because the impact you start today can have a lasting impact in others' lives. Whatever you have need of this evening, you can let it be made known while we stand and sing.